Girls. Are men the menace of your life, or have you found sufficient equality to be able to deal with them as equals? From a mere man's point of view, I would have thought that with the growing sameness of pay, work and responsibility, much of the battle of the sexes would have been settled once and for all.
Edna O'Brien is one of the most famous, infamous, beloved and influential Irish writers of the 20th century.
Does it distress you very much that some of your fellow countrymen call your work obscene or indecent?
No, I'm not always sensitive about it, because all the censors and bishops and judges, they're all men.
She came of age in a world where priests were princes, where pleasure was frowned upon, and women had little control over their own lives.
She was giving voice to the experience of young women in essentially what was a very repressive society.
The black underwear was Baba's idea. She said that we wouldn't have to wash it as often, and that it was useful if we ever had a street accident, or if men were trying to strip us in the backs of cars. Baba thought of all these things.
O'Brien's books were banned and burned for daring to suggest that women not only had sexual desires, but acted on them.
Examples of a free spirit like Edna were dangerous.
Which personal vice gives you most satisfaction?
Occasional adultery, like once a year.
Her novels are bold, but perhaps not as bold as her own story.
A label is attached to you, and that label was that I was scandalous.
Oh, well, she shagged all the great rock stars, you know, that's for sure.
At the age of 89, she's about to publish her 19th novel.
And there's Edna saying, oh, I'm off to Nigeria, where even the United Nations are warning journalists to beware. And there's Edna O'Brien striding in with her notebook in hand.
Now it's Edna's turn to tell her own story, a tale of innocence and experience, love and literature, sex, books, and a lifetime of defiance. April 1960. Harold Macmillan was in number 10. The Everly Brothers were topping the charts. And in a staunchly Catholic Ireland, a slim novel was about to make a very big splash.
Publication day was like any other. Reviews were to come in fits and starts, instances of praise marred by soundings from home.
Oh, ructions from all sides. I thought, this is not good. This is not good. I had anonymous letters which said, drown in your own filth. I had very ugly letters. I had letters about my treachery. I had letters about my betrayal. They poured in. I had a letter from my mother to say, everybody in the town, she called it a town. It was a hill with some pubs. Yes. Everybody is talking about your book. And then she said, the post office mistress said the other day that I should be kicked naked through the town. And in my wicked, duplicitous mind, I thought, why naked? Why not just be kicked?
The Country Girls is a coming-of-age story, following two young women, Kate and Baba, who have grown up in the stifling religious atmosphere of 1950s rural Ireland. But they're determined to seize life with both hands.
We want to live, drink gin, squeeze into the front of big cars and drive up outside big hotels. We want to go places, not sit in this damp dump. We want young men, romance, love and things.
While the book was celebrated in London and New York, in O'Brien's native Ireland, The Country Girls was banned and burned.
What is it that drove them nuts? What drove them nuts is the clear voice of a young country Irish woman rejecting the massive might of the culture mediated through the church.
We hadn't heard from generation after generation of women until Edna assumed permission, took the power upon herself, and she brought a whole consciousness of interior life and sex onto the page for the first time in Ireland.
From the altar, the priest said that copies of a certain book by a local author, a good Catholic girl who's convent educated, etc., had circulated in the town, and it would be advisable and in fact essential to bring those copies at rosary time in the evening, and there was a little conflagration, there was a little fire. My mother reported all this to me. She painted a picture, so to speak, and she said some of the women fainted. But she said, having held in her hand and the sin imparted itself, she said, well, Edna, and I can hear her voice still saying it, paper never refused ink. That was her way of saying, you have disgraced us.
The Country Girls is rooted in O'Brien's own childhood experience of growing up in rural Ireland. She was born in the village of Tuamgraney in County Clare in 1930, the youngest of 4 children.
Drewsborough was a large 2-storey house with bay windows and could be approached by 2 avenues. By the time I was born, we were no longer rich. The 1,000 acres or more that my father had inherited had been sold off in bits, or given away in fits of generosity, or bartered to pay debts. This was the house my mother strove to keep together, the house with our unfinished stories and our unfinished quarrels with one another.
So I want you to remember your childhood and Ireland and what it felt like at the very beginning. Well, how far does it go back, your memory?
But in terms of first memory, there are 2 opposing things. There is beauty and there is terror. The beauty is that although we lived in a sort of glorified farmer's house, it was a cut stone house, which to me was magic, because it was that sand-coloured stone that sparkled, and it had bay windows. So the outside was both beautiful and wild, whereas I found the indoors quite alarming and in some ways dangerous, fueled by my own imagination, of course, but there was also real danger.
Yes.
My father drank a lot. Most Irishmen drank, so let's not make it exclusive to him.
But he really drank.
But he was one of the unluckier ones whom drink did not suit. So he would go on what they call batters. He'd be gone for days, and we would watch for him through a window, my mother and I. And the first thing, he would come into the house and he would be shouting for her, to punish her, I think, mainly.
I ran down and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway, because there he was. There was my father, drunk, his hat pushed far back on his head and his white raincoat open. His face was red and fierce and angry. I knew that he would have to strike someone. A nice thing to come into an empty house. Where's your mother? I don't know. Answer my question. I dreaded looking into those eyes, which were blue and huge and bulging, like glass eyes. I don't know. He came over and gave me a punch under my chin, so that my 2 rows of teeth chattered together. And with his wild, lunatic eyes, he stared at me. Always avoiding me? Always avoiding your father? You little shit.
To me it was terror, to my mother it was terror. But looking back on it, it was also I love drink, God help us, I do. It was such a lonely way of drinking. My mother, in a way, was the person who held the reins, not the power, but she held the reins of the house together. She had a strong will and an absolute, unabatable work ethic. She worked all the time. I think I've inherited some of that. I set myself the role of being my mother's protector or minder, which to some extent I was. And therefore, she came to rely on me in a very, very, very dependent way.
Although well educated, Edna's mother was deeply suspicious of books and literature.
Here we are, we're sitting in this room and it's surrounded by books. I mean, in fact, the whole of your house.
Falling off the,
they're falling off the shelves.
Falling apart, like their owner.
Yeah. But there were no books in your household?
No books, no books. Prayer books, very, very, very gushing prayer books. My God, the prayers in them, the ecstasy. And the cook, Mrs. Beaton.
So where did your love of words, of language, of literature, where did it first make it?
Yes, it's a bit of a mystery, it's a bit of a puzzle, Alan. Where did it originate from? My love of words was absolute. It was my happiness. It was my way of existence. It was my way of making a world.
I would go out into the fields to write. The words ran away with me. I would write imaginary stories, stories set in our bog and our kitchen garden. But it was not enough, because I wanted to get inside them.
And in those days, I see myself as quite isolated in many ways. And that isolation has stayed with me, which is a good thing for writing and a drawback for living.
O'Brien's teenage years were spent at the Convent of Mercy in Loughrea, where she gained a stern education, shielded from the prying eyes of adolescent boys.
We were in all 300 women in that convent, a limestone bastion housing choir nuns, lay nuns, boarders and orphans, the sinful issue of unmarried mothers. 300 women with their humours and their tempers and their yearnings and their doubts and their several menstruations.
Tell us about what it was like in that convent, the convent school.
The sound was always of bells. The smell was of cabbage. The conversation was furtive. The food was dire. It was grim. It was granite grim. It isn't regimental, it's something deeper than regimental.
Good morning, girls.
I was very in love with one of my nuns. It was the same as the love of a man. It was pure, by pure, impure, whatever the words are. It was fanatic love. The presence of that person, the hush her veil made over a desk as she flew past. It was more than a crush, it was a kind of obsession. My love affair came to a bad end. The nun got cautioned. She was sent to another order for a while.
Why was she cautioned?
Because she was fond of me, I suppose.
Really?
She had strayed from the path of rectitude.
Now, was Ireland, at that time, this place where Catholicism was almost as suppressive and repressive as communism?
Oh, more, very similar. It was everywhere, it permeated everything. The priests were gods. They were gods, and they loved it. And they were, you know, very authoritative. And said, Christ is the unseen guest at every table. Christ is the silent listener to every conversation. Christ is the person walks beside. Christ is the mind reader. It was everywhere. And one of the things that used to fascinate me, as well as frighten me, was the word occasion of sin. There was sin, and there was occasion of sin. Any thought or person that might lead to sin. So one might fantasize about Clark Gable, as I know I once did. Well, to think about kissing Clark Gable was as sinful as kissing Clark Gable. So it didn't leave much space.
Our convent had always been proud of its modesty. Our girls, above everything else, are good and wholesome and modest. One expression of modesty is the way a girl dresses and undresses. She should do so with decorum and modesty. In an open dormitory like this, girls are requested to dress and undress under the shelter of their dressing gowns.
Edna really hit the nail on the head when she spoke about the Ireland that she spoke about in The Country Girls. Women were obviously confined to the home and possessed almost no rights over their bodies, over their sexuality, over what they did, what they chose not to do with their lives. It was impossible for a woman to exist without some kind of moral judgment being made.
Edna was determined to, not to be disrespectful, but to say, look, come on, of course, nuns bunk off with the gardener. I mean, that sort of stuff was transgressive then. Now, if you look at what's happened to the church now, you realise, how far ahead of her time she was.
In The Country Girls, Edna's heroines, Baba and Kate, take matters into their own hands when they devise a way to escape their claustrophobic convent life.
Baba held up a sheet of paper, and written on it was this: I have a plan at last that will expel us. We were supposed to be on silence, so we had to go somewhere to talk. I followed her down to the school and up the back stairs to one of the lavatories. She began at once, knowing that we couldn't stay there very long. We'll leave a dirty note in the chapel, as if it fell out of one of our prayer books. She was shaking all over.
The unmentionably obscene letter did the trick. Kate and Baba were expelled. For Edna herself, hard work was her means of escape. After months of studying by torchlight after her classmates had gone to sleep, she sat her final exams a year early. The world, with all its illicit pleasures, was beckoning.
Dublin was enthralling. Light flooded the pavements and glinted off the steel of the defunct tram lines and sent a gold-threaded haze up into a line of young trees where birds roosted. Dublin was full of stories, some funny and spry and sometimes gruesome. A blonde nurse known for her flamboyance who drove a red MG provided illegal abortions in a dingy room while ostensibly offering cures for dandruff and constipation.
Edna would spend the next 4 years training to be a chemist, one of the few careers that her parents would condone. But out of hours, she began her literary education.
This is the first book I owned, Introducing James Joyce by T.S. Eliot. This book taught me more than any other about writing. As I read it, I thought, my God, this is This is what I should be trying to write. This is the pulse of life. This is our family. This is that family. This is everything that life is. It set me on the road I had yearned to go on.
For Edna, like her heroines, Baba and Kate, Dublin would open up a whole new world.
The black underwear was Baba's idea. She said that we wouldn't have to wash it as often, and that it was useful if we ever had a street accident, or if men were trying to strip us in the backs of cars. Baba thought of all these things. I got black nylons too. I had read somewhere that they were literary, and I had written 1 or 2 poems since I came to Dublin. I read them to Baba, and she said they were nothing to the ones on mortuary cards.
I think about Kate and Baba, and I think they're the two sides of you, really.
They are. They are. That's what made it, that's what, in a way, helped it, because one of either wouldn't be enough.
Just like her heroine, Kate, the 18-year-old Edna O'Brien found herself involved with a man twice her age.
This was the first time I'd been out on a date in my life. He was one of the most handsome men I've ever seen. He looked like the German actor Conrad Veidt, which is to say his features were granite. He was very thin, very tall. We went to dinner 2 or 3 times, and I was invited to the country.
Edna's beau was Ernest Gebler, an enigmatic author with a previous marriage and a young son to his name.
He had a big library and a bookcase full of beautiful leather-bound books, and he had music on all the time. This was culture. This was real culture.
You can look now, I said, and he took his hand down from his eyes and looked shyly at my stomach and thighs. Your skin is whiter than your face. I thought it would be pink, he said, and he kissed me all over.
There had been in all probably 6 encounters, no more than 6. I met him in December, and I eloped in April. And there was immediate uproar from my family because my mother claimed to have received an anonymous letter that I was going out with, as is the phrase, a divorced man who was also, it said, a communist. Scandal of every kind.
Shocked and horrified, Edna's family went in pursuit and attempted to wrestle her away from the man they believed was leading her astray.
My family, with some men came and a brawl broke out on the road, and the police stood by. And my brother got me away from them, not in protection, in interrogation, into a car, to know if I was pregnant. I could be, because by now I had been with the man. And he was brutal, my brother. He said, if you're pregnant, we know a way to... He was very Catholic, but he said, we know a way to... He didn't use the word abort, but it was implied.
So there you are in this extraordinary circumstance. I mean, so shocking and moving.
And medieval.
And medieval, yes.
Mainly.
I mean...
Like, and Gothic, like a Gothic novel. Heroine in the night runs away. I mean, melodrama. It's all melodrama.
Yeah.
Against the wishes of her parents, Edna and Ernest were married 1 month before their son Carlo was born.
My sister Eileen came, and a poet and his wife, friend of Ernest Gebler, and the wedding was in the Bailey. Now, there are 5 of us, yes? We're all in very bad need of a drink, especially me. Not that I drank in those days, but on that occasion. And the nerves. He ordered a half a bottle of champagne. I thought, this is not promising.
Now married and cut off from her family, Edna moved into Ernest's house in County Wicklow.
And so, in truth, began my real apprenticeship as a writer. I was lonelier than I should be for a woman in love, or half in love. There was this gulf between us. So much about him seemed strange and distant.
I think he probably did love me, but he did not wish me to be a writer.
Over the next few years, Edna's relationship with Ernest would become increasingly strained.
He was himself not an encourager of lightness. He was a man who was trapped in terrible gloom, and that terrible gloom that encased him leached out and infected whatever it touched.
Edna would later draw on this period of her life in her novel Time and Tide.
Marry in haste, repent at leisure. Ah, yes. Her mother guessed that it was not roses. She could see it clearly on the last holiday, when her husband and she never addressed a word to each other. And when, on the nights when they played cards around the kitchen table, Walter made sarcastic remarks about her brainlessness. Her mother guessed and felt inwardly vindicated, but outwardly said nothing.
The one glimmer of light came via one of Ernest's literary associates, who gave Edna the opportunity that she'd been waiting for.
The publisher said, I'll make a deal with you. We need a publisher's reader. So you will read a book a week for us, and you will give your opinion of it. You post it back. We pay you £1 a week. You can write anything up to 1,000 words. Oh, it was like a stepping stone. Big time. So the book started pouring in, and I was extremely severe. I was very hard on people.
Then, in 1958, Ernest moved the family to London. He felt the change of scene might offer the boost that his writing career needed.
You go to London, you think you're expecting some other kind of place.
Oh, big time. Oscar Wilde, Cafe Royal, come on, the lot.
But Ernest had other ideas.
And we slowly drive through the Mecca of central London, going further and further, and we arrive at a tranche of very suburban houses. It was very, very uninspiring. And so we came to this small house, and we went inside, and I thought, oh my God, what have I done?
I think that was partly my dad's plan, was to imprison her in somewhere as far away from central London as possible, because she couldn't drive, obviously, in order to stop her mingling with the intellectual elite. So obviously it didn't quite succeed.
It was in London that I would find both the freedom and the incentive to write. Unhappy houses are a very good incubation for stories.
So what you did is you found refuge in books and eventually in
refuge,
writing.
Excitement, and escape.
2 years after their move to London, Edna O'Brien, now a mother of 2, sat down to write the book that would make her name.
The school started at 9, but I wrote it until it was then time to collect them from the school at either 3 or 3:30, non-stop. So I wrote it like someone, in a way, in a sort of semi-prison, that I had those hours to do it. There were a lot of tears shed, even though I was almost carried away writing it. And the tears were for a world that I had lived, and lived intensely, and had not fully realised how important it was to me until I left it. I doubt that I would have written it in a room in Dublin or in Wicklow, and I mean that. I
had to be away
escape.
from Dublin to do it.
I had to escape away from Ireland.
Away from Ireland to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
At the far edge of the lake, there was a belt of poplar trees shutting out the world I wanted to escape into. And now that I had come into the world, that scene of bogs and those country faces were uppermost in my thoughts.
I wrote it in 3 weeks exactly, and I knew when I had finished it. I knew it was the beginning of things, good things and not good things.
The publication of The Country Girls turned Edna into a literary sensation.
Edna O'Brien, and she's just written this book.
Does it turn you against your fellow countrymen that they do ban your books and films?
No, it doesn't turn me against them, because for every person who would hate or resent a book of mine in Ireland, there's someone else who would probably be quite glad to read it. And in a way, maybe if one lived or was brought up in a free country, there wouldn't be the same urgency to write or to scream.
Everyone was interested in her and interviews, and she was meeting Ted Hughes and other well-known writers. Oh, my father was jealous, unfortunately. When he met her, she was young, wasn't famous, and I think he thought, oh, I've got my protégé here, and suddenly the protégé's outgrown the master, and that wasn't in the script. That wasn't supposed to happen.
How does Ernest feel about the fact that you're, yes, notorious, but also successful and bringing in the money? And what happened to the money that you made from these books?
Well, I had to hand it over to my husband. And I did, to my discredit, I would say, or to my cowardice. But times were very different. Everything was more rigid then, and it was very hard for a woman or a girl woman, because I was sort of both. It was very hard. My defiance was only in secret on the page.
The months bore on inexorably, and although she knew that the marriage was doomed, she could not do anything other than weep. She could not leave him, that was certain. She could not stay with him, that too was certain. In some vague, unvoiced way, she was willing her own death.
Things brew for a long time, as you know. I always think like the Leaning Tower of Pisa will fall one day. And I realised I had sort of reached breaking points.
Things came to a head when a cheque for almost £4,000 for the film rights to Edna's second novel landed on the doormat. But this time, Edna refused to sign it.
Then he gripped her arm and brought her upstairs. And as they went upstairs, she had this premonition that she was not going to come down in one piece. In the bedroom, he closed, then locked the door, pushed her down on the bed, his hands like a vice on her throat, as he said in a very calm voice, "If you don't sign it, your life will not be worth living."
Oh, I remember very, very clearly the argument. That I do remember extremely clearly. I could hear the argument going on, and not long after that, the door opened, the front door, and she left.
I think she had no choice, to be honest. You know, it wasn't a sort of selfish, willful act. It was just that the atmosphere and everything had got so poisonous that I think she thought this is the only way.
I mean, that's a big decision to walk out
Walk
on
out,
the
huge
children
decision.
you loved.
Oh, adored. It was a very big decision, but in the state I was in, the kind of boxed in, completely overwatched and overjudged. In the state I was in, it was the only way I could do it.
And where did you go?
To Putney on foot. And I knocked on the door of a woman that I knew slightly, a Canadian woman. And she let me sleep on her sofa that night.
I'm not sure if she's told anyone this, but she actually left him the money from her next book. So, she had no money either. And that must have been very hard.
For a woman to leave the family home without money, without resources, without her children, because she has no choice, is still considered a shocking thing now and was considered absolutely shameful then. You married for life, and that was your lot. You had to put up with whatever happened after that.
A long and bitter custody battle between Ernest and Edna for their 2 sons ensued.
He said to my brother and I that this was crunch time. You now have to write me a letter saying where you want to live, what you want to do. My brother just said, I just want to go to Putney, which is where my mother lived. I wrote an equivocal letter saying it would be, occasionally we could go camping and so forth. I did it on the one hand, on the other, but I essentially said where I want to live is in Putney with my mother.
It was a new beginning. Edna and the 2 boys moved through a string of temporary accommodation. But life as a single mother was hard.
So she was doing newspaper articles, interviews, interviewing people, writing books, writing screenplays. And she was knocking stuff out because she had to, because she had no money and she was trying to buy a house. She'd be typing away at 10 o'clock at night.
The Country Girls trilogy had been a huge hit, and Edna's next novel, August is a Wicked Month, a simmering tale of a woman exploring her sexual freedom on the French Riviera, made Edna the talk of the town.
Her husband and son would not be back for a week or more, and she would be in a strange new place and let strange new things happen.
To speak about female sexuality and about a sexuality that existed outside the realm of marriage, that existed outside the realm of male control, that the body could be inhabited by a desire for pleasure, for happiness, for escape, because, there was really nothing fun for a woman's body in those years, and that was shocking. And it was exhilarating, I think, for her readers, for her female readers.
He put his face to hers and kissed her as he had not kissed her before. They made love, of course. The sun that had passed into her limbs and through her old bereaved bones came to life in her then, as they loved and struggled and fought and reunited.
I always liked August was a Wicked Month. I thought it was her most wicked book in the sense of it being delightfully wicked. It was also, as I remember, it was the one in which she came into her rightful place as an international writer and as an international woman.
With the proceeds from her writing, Edna bought a townhouse in Chelsea.
And we arrived in Carlisle Square, and it was all the square, and it was all glamorous, and the lights on in all the houses, and we thought, this is quite cool.
And for a brief, giddy period, the parties she threw there were legendary.
The parties were very large and raucous in a good way. maybe 100 people would come, 50, certainly. We would serve the alcohol. We would be sent to top up people's glasses.
People used to flock, as it were, by oracle, as if they had been summoned. They would come through the door. Many, I suppose, taking cannabis or whatever people took in those days.
Edna's guest list reads like a who's who of British culture.
And Elizabeth Taylor and the great Michael Caine and Susanna York. Marlon Brando stayed in my kitchen, I would like to say, and not in my bedroom. But he was a magnetic man. He was an amazing person to talk to.
One evening, I remember my brother and I were in bed, and my mama came in, and she said, "There's someone here to see you." And I went, "Really? Who?" And it was Paul McCartney. So, I mean, this was at the height of the Beatles' fame. And so he came and sat on the bed and sang us a little song. And I think he made it up. It was something like Edna O'Brien, she ain't lying, na 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 na. Anyway, the next day we went to school and no one would believe us.
And you were able to keep writing despite the fact that you were bringing up the children and you were partying.
I was partying a bit, not as much as the legend would have it, but then legends are always, you know, exaggerated a bit.
Ladies and gentlemen, Edna O'Brien.
As her public profile increased, Edna developed and then cultivated her reputation as a scandalous woman.
Well, she attracts incident. She attracts event, and she possibly makes event. You think that out of this rosebud mouth, petals are going to come out, and instead these axes fly out when she says exactly the thing.
Edna, your idea of a night out.
A night out, a perfect night out. Yes, it would be to go out with the man I love, who was quite generous and bought some champagne and didn't say, oh, it costs $1.80 a glass, and above all, didn't tell me how much he loved his wife. That would be awesome.
She never really found anyone that she liked who liked her. I think it was too much of a package because she was well known and she was often on television. I think a lot of men were put off, or the ones she was attracted to.
The woman who will write fantastically is a problem. A woman who will write fantastically about sex is really the worst kind of woman that you could possibly have to encounter, because this is not someone who is going to be willing to play the role which is sidekick, girlfriend, wife.
You sometimes talk about the two things, love and literature, and
Yes.
that actually literature won for you. I mean, love hasn't delivered for you, I sense, what literature has delivered for you, what writing has delivered for you.
No, I'm ashamed to say that, but it's the absolute truth. And it's not a very nice trait, but it's the fact. That is not to say I was not in love. I was, foolishly always. Impetuous. You know, I tumbled into love. Literature to me has answered a yearning, stronger than a yearning, has answered a vacuum that might be fleetingly met in life with a man.
For Edna, the words had always come easily, as had the rave reviews. But amidst all the parties and gaiety, something changed.
She'd been very successful in the 60s and early 70s, and suddenly, you know, reviews weren't good, and I think she felt she'd come to a bit of a impasse. There was a period in her life when her books weren't very well received. I think she was a bit unhappy emotionally, and, you know, these things can all mount up.
A writer is always worried that she or he will stop, not will stop writing, but the writing will stop coming.
In search of creative inspiration, Edna decided to try something quite extreme.
Dr. Ronald David Lang is a British psychiatrist and author. His books, including The Divided Self, The Politics of Experience, and Knots, have won him a wide following.
All of these different states of consciousness
are states of consciousness which are ephemeral.
Now, Artie Lang was a really big deal.
Phenomenon.
Everybody was talking about Artie Lang. He was a very riveting man, very riveting as a person. He was very contentious as well, and I have to say I was smitten with him, definitely. I asked him, he didn't ask me, if he would give me LSD. And he said, I'd like to stress one thing. He said, to most Roman Catholics to whom I have given LSD, they only have crucifying trips. Did that deter me? No.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Like nectar, she took it, drank it down. It was not long before it began to work. When she looked up, she saw that he had become a rat. He was Dr. Rat, perched on her velvet prayer chair. Her chaise lawn reeled on its buckling casters and received her like a groaning corpse.
I lay on the floor, fighting the most incredible and weird and mutating and carnivorous creatures, all of whom were talking to me. I was terrified.
Then the visitations. Faces, mouths, a pair of floating lips complete with porter-foamed moustache, and Dr. Rat dancing to his own esoteric reveries.
I remember a moment then, and it must have been an hour or two later, in which I'd begged of him. I said, take me out of hell, take me out, bring me back, bring me back. My whole being was turned inside out. My mind was literally as if you took the mind, you scooped what was in it out, and you filled it with other things. It changed me.
Between the mid-1970s and the mid-80s, Edna O'Brien experienced something of a lost decade. For 10 years, she did not write a single novel. But she came storming back in the 1990s with a powerful series of state-of-the-nation stories, confronting the harsh realities of contemporary Ireland.
To put in context, there's a civil war in the north. The euphemism was troubles, like you had a stomach ache or something. No, 3,600 people dead. This is a civil war. You had the complicity of a corrupt government, cronyism to the nth, shipping arms and money to the killers in the north. You had an utterly corrupt church, which we now know were engaged in fucking the children of their parishioners on a regular basis. And they were silent about most of this, except for a few brave souls. A war of a kind was going on, though no one admitted it, a war in bursts. Young men coming down from up north, coming down to rob banks and post offices, postmistresses in lonely stations in dread of their lives, ordinary folk too in dread of these faceless men with their guns and their hoods. One had been shot dead on a road not far away. It was in the papers. A photograph of the very spot, details of the rounds of ammunition, the nickname of the victim, his comrade who had got away, who hijacked a timber lorry and held a guy at gunpoint for 3 hours. It was well known, well reported, discussed again and again, the number of rounds fired, the angle at which the guard shot, the type of wound, the time it took your man to die.
I got savaged because I took the side of a terrorist, which wasn't the truth. I wrote a story of an IRA man and a woman in the South, and their story of how the war from the North leaked into the South or affected the South.
I think one of Edna's great qualities is the ability to transform herself. Not easy to do for an artist. You always, attempted to do what you did before. But she would strike out in new directions. And this latest phase of hers, this political phase, astonished me.
With Down by the River, Edna would delve into even more challenging territory, telling the story of an ordinary Irish teenager who hides an abominable secret. For years, she has been sexually abused by her father, a crime her community chooses to ignore.
He touches her forehead with his, bumping it smartly, making her do return bumps and repeat the refrain. When she comes, when she comes. He is talking, telling imaginary swains to keep off, that it is not an excuse me dance, it is his dance. They can ride the hacks, he rides the hunter. The temperature of her body goes from hot to freezing and back to hot again, and her limbs, especially her legs, seem substanceless. In the whirling daze, she sees ornaments as if flying, and in the blotched mirrors of the swinging sideboard door, she sees their feet. His fawn jobbers, the buckles of her shoes, and the ground becomes mercury under her. I'm dizzy. We're going to have to stop now, Dad.
Down by the River drew on the real-life case of a 14-year-old girl that had gripped the Irish headlines.
Down by the River was inspired by a pregnancy of a young woman made pregnant by her father's golfing companion. She came to England to the Mary Stopes Clinic to not have the baby. She was recalled home by the Attorney General because she was underage, and the country was up in arms.
Down by the River is a novel that I can't imagine any other person in the planet being brave enough at that time. I mean, abortion was illegal in Ireland. The church were absolutely swelling with rage that a novelist of distinction, could see clearly what the moral force of that problem was, and with enormous delicacy and with enormous empathy could write from inside that woman's experience.
Dear Luke, I have something huge to ask you. I know it's awful, but I think I'm going to be a mother and I'm afraid. I will go to a doctor soon. The person's whose it is the last person's it should be. I would rather not say. Ever. Out in the country, things get very murky. I would like to live in a city, because if you scream, someone can hear you.
I had a very hard time with it. I had a very hard time. The Irish purported that I had been so long out of Ireland, I lost touch with Ireland. God Almighty, the stories I was writing were set in Ireland.
Absolutely.
And when you don't leave a country just by leaving it.
The artist's job is to articulate the culture long before the culture understands that that's what they're thinking and requires articulation. So really, the successful artists assume the zeitgeist and make it concrete. And she has done that habitually.
In 2018, the Irish electorate voted by a 2/3 majority in favour of abolishing the 35-year ban on abortions.
Under the 8th Amendment, we said to women in crisis, take the boat or take the plane. Today we say, take our hand.
We made history!
3 years ago, at the age of 85, Edna O'Brien sat down to write her 19th novel, which she vows will be her final book.
I wanted a Greek story. What happened in the Iliad I wish I was Homer and his cohorts, but I'm not. I wanted the language to have the rawness and bloodiness of that.
I was a girl once.
I was a girl once.
But not anymore.
But not anymore. I smell. Blood dried and crusted over me and my wrapper in shreds. My insides a morass. Hurtled through this forest that I saw. That first awful night when me and my friends were snatched from school.
The novel confronts perhaps the most searing subject of Edna's career. The teenage girls abducted, imprisoned and raped by Boko Haram in Nigeria.
When she sees a grotesque atrocity like happening to young girls in northern Nigeria, immediately she's on red alert. Puts on her knapsack and hiking boots, and off she goes. This would be absolute grist to her mill, familiar territory in an odd way, and get her blood boiling.
This trauma that you pursued and this abuse of these women, these young girls, that's something that you pursued in so many of the books that you've written.
Yes.
Is that what's at the heart of Girls?
I have deliberately called it an imaginative journey because those girls, first of all, they're very shy and very understandably reserved about describing the actual physical, sexual, ongoing, brutal horror, because they're ashamed of it. That was the sad thing. They're ashamed of sin or crime. There's the old Catholic in me coming out. They're ashamed of something they are not responsible for. So they would say, I cried a lot, or it hurt, or I bled. It was the doctors and the trauma experts and the NGO and nurses and that who told me some of the more awful detail. And I still had to imagine a lot as well.
Very soon men began to foregather. They were young and frisky. They wore jeans and variously collared t-shirts. It was clear that something was about to happen that involved us, so we clung to each other. Two men wheeled a table and set it down in the middle of the compound, while a third man put a white plastic bucket underneath it. Only seconds passed, but we guessed. The first girl, Faith, was taken. And as she lay down, two men parted her legs.
The others were baying and cheering. As she began to scream, a hand was clamped across her mouth, and the first of the youths had his turn with her.
Now, you may ask, and indeed I ask, why would I say to myself there and then, I have to write that book? Why would I go to Nigeria twice to write a book about material that, to put it mildly, is horrific? Unless I wanted to go into the zone of hell and yet believe I can come out.
Weren't you frightened?
Fearful and fearless.
Fearful and fearless.
Yeah.
That's who you are.
It's a bit of a handicap, to tell you the truth. Because you've done the fearless thing, and now you're afraid of what you've done.
For her, suddenly at this point in her life, to take a leap completely into the unknown, for her to write not about Ireland, to suddenly be situating herself in another country, and in, you know, and not in a European country, in Africa, somewhere that is very other, that has a different culture completely from ours. I think it's a sign of what an extraordinary woman she is, what an extraordinary writer she is, that she will just continue to take risks and do the things that nobody thinks that she should do, that she could do. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
But Edna, of course, has never been averse to risk.
The other thing I gather is you took money with you.
Oh, I did.
A lot of money?
A lot of money.
How much money? Thousands?
15.
15,000?
I needed this money for the amount I would have to give to this person, that person, because there's a much more extensive and many more people to be interviewed and having to be rewarded.
And how did you get the money in?
Well, it was a little bit lewd.
Lewd?
I think I've got to put it on my person. I've got to break up the money into little wads of 2,000. By now, I am full of money in various parts of my underwear, my clothing, my sleeves, and all else. But I am not happy about this, because I think this is asking for trouble. Whether it was the hand of God or whether this woman said, just let her go by. I leave customs area out into the lobby.
With your 15,000?
With the 15,000. I would never do that again.
I think not.
And it all got spent.
Last year, Edna O'Brien's extraordinary writing life was celebrated when she received the prestigious PEN Nabokov Award for Achievement in International Literature. And almost 6 decades after her first novel, The Country Girls, was banned and burned in Ireland, Edna is back in Dublin with a brand new production of the story. A poignant return to her native country, which is now embracing her work.
Great literature helps you to live your life. And I think Edna has helped not only generations of women, but human beings all over the world to live their lives. That's what great books do. Edna gave us courage, permission, and heart.
I ran out onto the deck to see the last of Dublin. I could hardly believe that we were moving, that we were leaving Ireland. And gradually, the city of Dublin started receding in the mauve twilight of a May evening. The gulls flew slowly with us, their screaming unwinding the scream inside me. Am I throwing everything away? Love, my country, even the Scairtin. I have to go. I'm going. 'Tis like the dark water is taking us to a bright, unwritten place.
I want Edna to take a bow for all that's happened to her, for all that's been visited upon her, for all the things said about her and to her. I want her to be celebrated.
Her example said to us, you can do as I've done. You don't have to be under the thumb of these awful people. You know, rise up. She was an example of freedom.
Edna as a person has come to define so many things. She's really embodied the struggle for Irish women to have their voices heard. But now at last, I think she's really being seen as the force that she is. She is an unsurrendering woman.
Beautiful young woman, beautiful older woman, fascinating life, great writer, very important to Ireland. What a girl.